Okay, so we are at part one of a new D word here after dividing theology, which we did two parts of that. But this one's going to be the first part of determining theology. And at first glance, you might think to yourself, and I don't mean determining like you're determining the truth. No, you're discovering the truth. But the theologian is, as an actor, there's a subjective component. You may notice if you read theology books that they don't all say exactly the same thing. That means there's some determining going on. So all I mean by determining is the theologian is looking at the body of what the Bible teaches and God's revelation, and he is saying to himself, where do I start? And the question, remember from last week, and where do you start? If you have a hang-up here, as the presuppositional tradition has unfortunately conditioned people to have, where do you start is really an ambiguous phrase. What do you mean by that? Do you mean the front door or the foundations? And even then, there's complexity beyond that. But when we're doing theology as Christians, we have a foundation, and somebody might break in there and say, yeah, I know God and His nature. Somebody else might break in and say, yeah, I know God's Word and the Scriptures. And we'll cover that part of it more next week as far as different, you might say different perspectives on where to start, what's meant by that. But what we're going to do today in introducing the subject is talk about the order of our theology. So when I talk about determining theology, I mean what goes at the center and why. And does that have any effect at all on the things that are at the periphery? That's a solar system analogy. Or, if you want a house analogy, what goes at the foundation, and does that in any way determine the structure, right? If I make the central thing in my theology the church, and I put that front and center, that's not hypothetical. Rome does that. Okay? Does that affect anything? And the answer is yes, it does. And I can multiply examples from there. I think you get the idea. So what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at order. The theologian's ordering. What we want to argue is that the theologian who is subjectively ordering had better pay attention to what I'm going to call an objective order. So 2 points today, an objective order and an absolute order. And the objective order part of it is the way we've been talking, but the word absolute, that's a word that's introduced and talked about by a theologian that we've covered, and we quoted from him already, a guy named W.G.T. Shedd. So he talks about that absolute order thing, okay? So that's what we're going to talk about today, and see if that makes any difference at all. So first of all, I'm going to introduce some terms, some grammar, and just get going. First of all, dogmatic theology or systematic theology has an objective order. That's our first point. It has an objective order. Let me give you a syllogism and see if you could just hang with this. This will be super simple, except that since I don't have a board, you have to watch it later and get the graphic. You can't visualize the syllogism, so you can write it if you want or whatever else. But here it is. Premise 1. All truths are objects of the mind. Okay? That's my first premise. All truths are objects of the mind, even if they're about physical stuff. Water boils at 212. Hey, that's not an object of the mind. No, it still is. That still is. All truths are object of the mind. Premise 2. All relations between truths are truths. So remember that syllogism from a couple weeks ago? It was sort of an experiment, but it doesn't even matter what the subject is. Let me just think of something off the top of my head. Oh yeah, there we go. Here's a scripture over here. It says Jesus is God. It's a pretty important one. Here's a scripture over here that says Jesus is man. Jesus is human. And so what I'm going to say, I'm going to do a really crazy thing here. I'm going to say, hey, maybe Jesus is both God and man. And there's an actual rule of inference in systematic logic that talks about that. I won't bore you with what that rule is, but just follow me for a second. If, premise 1, Jesus is God, and if, premise 2, Jesus is man, then it follows that Jesus is both God and man. Now, the connection between those first two premises, I'm arguing, is itself a truth. You see that? So we're not after ink blots here. Well, the Bible never says that Jesus has a dual nature. Certainly never uses big words like hypostatic union. Okay, those are just words that theologians came up with to accurately represent that third truth, namely the connection or the relationship between the two truths that are on the surface. On the surface, Jesus is God. Jesus is man. And then I draw a circle around it. I mentally draw a circle around that. That circle is itself an object of truth. Okay? And it's implied, it's contained in the other two truths. You see that? Okay, it'd be better with a board, but I think you get the idea. Okay, so all relationships between truths are themselves true objects of the mind. Now, let's get to the next point. So you have that firmly fixed in your mind. One of the ways that the Bible talks, believe it or not, some people say, don't bring philosophy in or don't bring Aristotle into the scriptures and things like that. But actually the Bible itself uses Aristotelian language because actually Aristotle didn't invent logic, he just discovered it. And one of the very logical things that Aristotle did was he would talk about different kinds of causes. You know this if you've been in the academy, these 4 different, and then later Aristotelians added a 5th, 5 different kinds of cause. This is sometimes called causal analysis. And you know these if you've been there, the 2 ultimate ones on the end, the efficient cause, which is the actor, and the end cause, which is the reason for his action. Then you have all those things on the ground, the material cause, the formal cause, and then the instrumental cause. If it's an intelligent actor using an instrument, that's where that 5th cause comes in. So this idea of causal analysis is really why we have prepositions in our language. And those words actually mean something. If I say, I am under the law, you would understand that differently than that my pen fell under the desk, right? They would both mean something. One is simply a spatial position. One's a different kind of position, but it's still a thing. Otherwise, our words have no meaning, right? And the Bible uses this kind of language in ways that if you didn't pay attention to it, you wouldn't get the same meaning out of it. Let me give you a couple of examples. Ephesians 2:8-10. Pretty famous verse. And the prepositions are going to matter. The order of the prepositions are going to matter. If you change them, it means something totally different. You've got a different theology, different understanding of God and man. So Paul says there in Ephesians 2:8-9, we'll tackle those first and then we'll bring in verse 10, that it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not as a result of works, so that no one should boast. And then he brings in another end cause afterwards, but I'll get to that in a second. Notice, first of all, in that passage, 3 kinds of causes. One is the efficient cause, the ultimate cause, and that's grace. It's by grace you are saved through faith. What kind of cause is that? Anybody that's the instrumental cause, right? So the intelligent actor, God, who's the real ultimate cause. The grace is the grace of God. It's an action of God. It's a disposition of God. But here it's also an action and a power of God. His grace is the ultimate actor saving. That grace uses the instrument of faith. Through faith. And then he doubles down. He says, this is not your own doing. He adds that to make sure we understand that. Not as a result of works. Here comes an end cause. Liable to miss it. So that. What do those words mean? Those are purpose words. Those are design words. Those are end words. This act happened for the purpose that we would not boast. Now, verse 10 gives you another end cause, which in another sense is also material, formal, and instrumental cause. Verse 10 goes on to talk about us being his workmanship. We are created in Christ Jesus for good works, which he prepared beforehand, that we should walk on. It's like he gives us 2 and 3 triple end cause there, right? 3 purposes, so that we won't boast, so that we will, unto good works. Some people say salvation has nothing to do with works. No, you're saved unto works. You're saved through works. You're saved passing through all sorts of works. What you mean to say is that your works don't contribute to your justification. Okay? Justification is a crucial part of salvation, but it's not the whole of salvation. So, you see what's happening here? You take away one of those prepositions, and all of a sudden, by the way, when did I quote Aristotle in there? I don't recall myself doing it. I think I was quoting just Paul. But you notice that Paul taught, now you're going to go up to Paul and say, now Paul, come on, don't bring Aristotle into this. Don't bring these causes, because if you mess around with one of those causes, Paul would be the first person to slap you and say, what are you doing there? You get yourself a false gospel because you got your prepositions. It's called prepositional theology. There's a lot of metaphysics. There's a lot of being and cause and the real nature of things under the surface, underneath those little seemingly insignificant prepositions. Okay? And you tie that together with there's other passages that talk about faith being used this way and all these different things, and that's right. And you've got to be able to sort those out. Otherwise, it's just this enormous puzzle that's just thrown on this giant table, and you've got no box top. You don't know how to put it together. Okay? And so causal analysis, prepositional metaphysics, the Reformers utilized this language for a reason. It wasn't just in the medieval era. You read Francis Turretin's Institutes of Eclectic Theology, and he is all about correcting the Roman Catholic false gospel by saying, no, this faith is the instrumental cause. It's the sole instrumental cause. Christ's work is the sole material cause. And what's he arguing against? Well, part of what he's arguing against is the sacramental theology of the Catholic Church and sharing some of that load, sharing some of that cause. You mess up that cause, you've got yourself a different gospel. Don't be shy there, back there. So that actually matters. This is what we mean by objective order, that it's not just this thing and this thing, like salvation is just this atomistic, this thing bumped into this thing, and so I believe both things. No, I believe the order in which they happen. That's a third thing. And so on and so on and so on. And that actually matters to your theology. It makes theology. You get a different theology with a different order. Okay? So the objective nature of the Christian system of truth. This is crucially important for all sorts of reasons. For unity, for charity, not just for being discerning and making your theology as crisp as possible, but theologians have to be able to operate like this without being chirped at by those who don't study theology, but which in our very democratic, anti-intellectual age, small d, I just mean we've democratized truth, we've democratized things, we've democratized authority, and theologians don't have room to talk like this anymore without being burned at the stake. But it's funny that we still burn people at the stake. We do it differently, and different people do it. Now it's the mob that does it, not the church authority, and they do it to the would-be church authority. For speaking theological truth. But why does this happen? I would argue the first reason this happens is because we don't even understand what objective truth is. I know I touched on this in week 1. Let me bring it back because this is going to be important, okay? When we talk about objective truth, we mean that the thing is truth. The thing that I'm talking about is outside of my mind. Its reality, its nature is independent of my mind. It's independent from your mind. It's independent from individuals and from groups of individuals. It's independent from church traditions and other things like that. Okay, so it is what it is and not something else. So it's just law of identity, right? Subjective means the knower, right? So you have the knower versus the thing known. The thing known is objective. The knower is subjective. Okay, I know that's review. But when we come to this question of the system of Christian truth, the first thing we have to get in our minds is that when I talk about the Christian faith, I'm talking about something outside of you and outside of me. Now, the New Testament talks about the word faith in both ways. It does talk about it subjectively, like it's talking about your faith. But it's also talking about it objectively. So Jude 3, contend for the faith. Ephesians 4, there is one faith. And so it talks about it in an objective sense, meaning a body of beliefs. The Eastern worldview doesn't talk like this. And here I mean the religion of the East. I think they cheat, and we cheat as postmodern Westerners when we try to get away from this. But let me say it like this, and this is the way I said it for years. We have to be able to make a distinction between persons and the propositions. In other words, there's a difference between me and the chair that I'm looking at. These are two different things. My perspective on the chair and the chair are distinct. The chair, its nature, its reality is objective. My perspective on the chair, that's subjective. That's finite, it's fallible, it's limited, and so forth. Okay? But it's not just the chair that has to be treated objectively. My statement, and I'm not going to give you a number because I already forgot, but let's just pretend that chair was exactly 6 feet away from me. Exactly. My proposition, that chair is 6 feet away from me. If we were to measure that proposition up against the real truth of whether it is or not, that proposition has to be treated objectively. The standard for the truth or falsity of that proposition has to be treated objectively. Okay? Now, why does this matter? I mentioned charity and unity, and where'd that go? Well, here's the first place it went. When I say that such and such a false belief will lead to this unorthodox conclusion, okay? So I have to believe that man is basically good, that he's born sinless, which is already heresy, is going to lead to this other particular heresy. When I say that, I'm actually not talking about your mommy. Most people don't know that. Most people don't understand that. What they heard was, you're the only church? You're the only Christian? Only you and people that agree with you will be in heaven? The people down the block at that church aren't saved? And you have to go back and say, nope, it's not what I said. I said that this belief, which is outside of you and outside of me and outside of your mommy, that belief, that proposition is what it is outside of us. It will lead to that. Oh, so they won't be saved in the end. Okay, let's try it again. This is the struggle. And I've been doing this for 15 years plus now, and most people, and depending on where they are, some people just struggle with it at the beginning, and you have to re-educate Westerners in the old classical understanding of truth. That this is not the Eastern worldview. Thou art that. There's no distinction between the person and the proposition. Okay, you actually have to re-educate people in the objective world. I remember the first year I was a church planter with this one individual, 18-year-old guy. Loved truth, he'd read R.C. Sproul books, he'd read John Piper, he loved it, he was eating it up. But I actually had to spend more than a half hour, and it wasn't conclusive even after that, with a wooden pulpit. I was at a wooden pulpit in a living room and saying to him, because he was struggling, what if people don't get it though? Yep, that's bad. That's not good. It's like, and he literally couldn't get his mind around the idea that this wooden pulpit is here. Whether you stumble in it or not, whether you bump into it, whether you say, well, what if everybody pretends not to see it? Well, then you might bump into it, but it's still going to be there. I literally had to re-educate him in the nature of the real world outside of our minds. And he was just being honest. He was just saying at the surface what most people actually struggle with. They actually cannot separate persons and propositions. So one of the things we're going to do a lot over the next few weeks, months, years, I don't know how long, Lord willing, however long the series goes, is we're going to do polemical theology. You mentioned that 2 weeks ago. Polemical theology that studies God's truth with respect to errors. Aberrant theologies. And one of the things we're going to say about aberrant theologies is that this A will lead to B. And that B is what we call heresy. It's not good. It's bad. And what a lot of people around you will hear is, oh, they're not really Christians, or you're better than them. That's what they'll hear. That's all they can hear. And you actually literally just re-educate people and all that. And I can say it over and over and over again and have whole classes on it, just hypothetically called Doctrine and Division, still on sermon audio. And I could have whole classes like that, and then people who were obligated to be leaders to read the book and listen to those, even though I painstakingly draw this out, and I try not to be condescending, but I realize afterwards, you weren't condescending enough. You shouldn't be condescending. I just mean clear. But if you're that clear, it can come across as condescending. And then those people, 5 years later, will say, no, you're saying that we're the only church. You're saying that those guys aren't Christian. Facepalm. What can you do? That's called stubbornness. I mean, when leaders do that, that's purposeful. That's purposeful. Okay. So the proposition versus the person. When we speak of the objective relationships between Christian doctrines, that one leads to another, there's a tendency there. When we do that, we're speaking of these objects of truth outside of our minds. Next step. When we do that, I mentioned the word heresy, we're going to use a word essential. We'll unpack this a little bit today, a little bit next week. Essential. It comes from a Latin word esse, E-S-S-E, which means being. Okay? I realize Bill Clinton was very confused about this, the meaning of the word is, but we're not going to be. Is a thing. I'm going to go out on a limb. No, it's not. It's just a placeholder. And it's quicksand, linguistically and logically for you. Okay? We're going to say it's a thing. That's why they're called being verbs. They totally be. They be. They be there. Okay? And that Latin word, esse, is where we get the word essential. So, for example, boiling water is essential. I said this one time, and some smart aleck said, "No, you can cook macaroni and cheese without boiling water." And I said, just stick with the analogy here. It's not meant to tell us everything. Yes, you could. All right. Water is essential to making, anyway. That's what we mean by essential. Okay, the Latin peoples have another phrase for it, the sine qua non, the without which not. You take it away, boom. It's like taking the foundation away from a house, taking the sun away from a solar system, right? You take away you couldn't do this, but if you take away the DNA from me, you get the idea. If you take away that which is essential to a thing, you don't have a thing there anymore. Or it's a radically different thing. And there's different levels of essentiality, which we'll get to, but that's the next step we need to get to. We have an objective definition of essentiality. So put the two things we've talked about so far together. If we have an objective definition about the relation between things, if that relation is also a thing, and the most foundational of those relationships is whether or not a thing is essential to a system of beliefs, we're going to treat that essentiality objectively too. Is everybody with me so far? That something is essential is an object outside of our minds. I am not its essentiality. I am not Christianity. The church down the block you're worried about is not orthodoxy. Your mama is not orthodoxy or heresy. You hear people say all the time, humble orthodoxy, generous orthodoxy. And it's like, I've never met an arrogant or humble doxy in my life. Never met the man. I don't know what you're talking about. Now, I'm being facetious because they're being full of it. And I'm calling them on it. Okay? When we talk about essence, when we talk about the essence of a system of beliefs, we're not talking about ourselves or our best intentions or our worst intentions. We're talking about the system of belief. Over there, far away from me, it's over there. It's not me. Okay? So, when we ask what is essential to the body of Christian beliefs, we are not speaking about one's subjective faith. So there's a legitimate way to speak about the subjective. So, for example, here's another way you can make the same mistake. You say the Trinity is essential to Christian belief, which I learned long ago, don't say it like that because people will hear this immediately subjectively. The Trinity is objectively essential to the body of Christian beliefs, to Christian orthodoxy is the way I'd rather say it. Because guess what people are going to hear when you say that? I know tons of people that don't even understand the Trinity, like me, myself. You're saying I'm not saved? Okay. I see what happened there. Okay. When you hear the words the faith or the Christian faith or to faith or whatever, that's why I try to not say it like that, you're hearing you have to believe this to be saved. That's what you're hearing. And that is the way most Americans talk about it. Even very reputable Christian teachers will sometimes speak like that. Well, there's a handful of things in the Bible that you have to believe to be saved. Man, I would dare say that even those things that you're talking about, you're probably being less charitable than you think you're being. We can get the doctrine of the Trinity wrong, which we do all the time. I mean, do you get the doctrine of the Trinity as well as the people that showed up at Nicaea got it? I'm guessing no. Right? I learn more every day, like, man, looks like I need to study this more. Doesn't mean I wasn't saved 5 minutes before, okay? So the first mistake people are making is they're hearing this thing essential to belief to be essential to subjective to somebody's salvation, okay? And however interesting and important that question may be in other contexts, when we're building a system, when we're studying systematic theology and we're trying to lay the foundation and say, okay, what are the rules? What's the nature of it? What's the method? When we're having that conversation, the subjective thing is miles away. Please keep it miles away. That's not what we're talking about. None of us are the system of Christian belief, okay? I am laboring this point hard because this will come back. I'll get complaints. Send all emails to me, but I'll just be repeating this stuff, okay? Finally, there's concentric circles about this. If somebody asks, what's essential? What's essential to believe? My first question, because the subjective question is important. I don't want to dismiss it. I don't want to say that's not important. You're a parent. What do my kids need to believe? Sure, it's important. So depending on who's asking, now we're back in the church context for a second, I always want to ask a clarifying question. Essential to what? Okay, when somebody says, where do we draw the line on this practice or this doctrine? Or, the question is, we're going to fellowship with this church or that church or do this conference or do this school or hire this person or whatever else. And somebody asks, well, what's your view of essential? The baptism controversy comes up and says, and somebody says, is this essential or non-essential? Your question, I commend this question to you. Always ask the person, essential to what? And then flesh it out in the following way. A couple different categories. We could be talking about what is essential to subjective individual faith. That's one we've already covered. Subjective individual faith, not unimportant, but it might not be what the person's talking about. Secondly, we could be talking about essential for membership in a local church. What's the bar there for members? Thirdly, we could be talking about leadership in that same local church. Higher bar, right? Obvious reasons. James 3:1. Let not many of you teach, brothers. It's a stricter standard. You get it. Fourthly, we could be talking about fellowship with other ecclesial or some parachurch Christian organization. What's essential to agree with them about in order to do this thing with them? Perfectly legitimate, good question. Still might not be what we're talking about. Belief to be orthodox per se, and that's especially relevant when it's a teacher. Okay? Are they a heretic? Lay people typically aren't heretics, even if they get the essentials wrong. See my sermon back at the end of Titus to get that distinction. Sixthly, are we talking about essential for a belief to sufficiently maintain other orthodox entailments over time? Well, that one was wordy, but here's the problem. That's the one we're talking about in this class. So let me say it again. When we talk about essentiality, we're talking about none of those things. We're only talking about what is essential for a belief, an idea, a truth, a doctrine, to sufficiently maintain other orthodox entailments, implications, over time. Okay? That's what we're talking about. We're talking about the kind of things that if you touch the body of beliefs, not me, not your mama, not that church down the block, not your feelings, none of that, when you see that, now we're going to go from house to solar system to a ball of yarn. So here's a different metaphor. When I touch the system of Christian belief, orthodoxy, not a person, orthodoxy, when I take that, I find a string, whether it's the nature of man or the nature of Jesus or the nature of Scripture, and I pull. What we're going to mean by essential is it's the kind of thing that if you pull, unravels the whole ball of yarn. Does that make sense? Okay? And we'll see that as we go through the system of Christian beliefs. But when I'm going to talk like that, and at no point are you supposed to say, he just pulled my mommy out of the body of Christ. No. Unless she's a reputable teacher that is teaching a lot of other people, which is already a problem. Did anybody catch it? Anyway. But unless we're talking about a teacher of people teaching in public in the church context, then that would affect that. Okay? So that's the first thing we want to say. There is an objective order to systematic theology. If you mess with the order, you've got yourself a different theology. That may or may not be critical enough to be heterodox, or it might. But that's the first thing we mean. Secondly, there's our second of 2 points today. Glad we started early. Dogmatic theology has an absolute order. Not just objective, it is what it is outside of my mind, but an absolute order. Now I'm going to make the argument that what you put in the middle, at the center, at the foundation, depending on your metaphor, matters. One foundation might be more conducive to stay put and to uphold other Christian doctrines than other doctrines. W.G.T. Shedd, he reasons for a theology that is an absolute science. He says no science can be any more a priori than its subject matter. Now, there he's just getting into method, and we talked a little bit about that in week 1 when we talked about theology being a science, so don't be weirded out by that word. We'll use the word science and study interchangeably. But he's saying it's the highest science, but what you put at the center, therefore, has to matter. Shedd says this. It's a very interesting quote. When we pass from the world of matter to that of mind and morals, in other words, when we pass from the things that the physical sciences study, or history studies even, to mind and morals, we find more than a relative necessity in the object of cognition. In other words, the thing you're talking about has to be necessary, not just in a relative way. So science has necessary principles relative to science, scientific method, quantity, whatever else. History has some basic things that it does, about sources, for example, and whatever, that are necessary for its science, but they're not necessary for reality to exist. What Shedd is saying is that the higher you go in the science and the thing that you're looking at, the more the necessity cannot be relative to something else anymore, but must have its necessity in itself. So Shedd says, the divine mind and the human are the subject matter of theological and metaphysical science. But mind is reason, and reason is marked by necessity and immutable properties, unchangeable things that you're looking at. Accordingly, the laws of mind have more necessity in them than the laws of material nature have. So, the stuff as you go higher, the stuff you're looking at is more absolute. That's the word he uses. More immutable. Therefore, the truths about them will be more necessary. Let me say it that way. So metaphysically, the thing is more immutable. Therefore, the science about them, its basic principles, have to be more necessary. Not just to theology, but to science, to history, and everything else. But all he's talking about is that as you get closer to the center, that bad boy had better be more necessary of a truth, and as you get more to the periphery, then it could be more relative. So you see that? Relative to the center. So in other words, he's arguing that there is a center, that there is a foundation. Most theologies today would even, not even agree with that. Oh, there's a center? Who gets to decide? And the foundation and all that's the same thing. Same kind of postmodern nonsense. Shedd's model of theology, then, is as an absolute science. And what he suggests, and there's two competitors here, this is at the end of the 19th century, Shedd is saying the method of an absolute science has to be Trinitarian. In other words, it has to have the triune God as that foundational block or center or whatever. Not even Christological. Now, there's a bunch of competitors, but he puts this one that's the most understandable, most pious, the most Christian that you can come up with. Wait a minute, I thought we're supposed to be Christ-centered. And Shedd will have none of that because he recognizes that that could be a bunch of virtue signaling long before they had that term. But it has to be, the center, has to be Trinitarian. The foundation, let's go with that. The foundation has to be Trinitarian, not even Christological. Now, why on earth is that? Let me give you a hint. Machen one time said to the liberals, Jesus was a monotheist. Yeah, duh. What was he getting at? He's saying, and really it's what Calvin said in his doctrine of the twofold knowledge of God, that you can't really understand God as the creator unless you understand him as the redeemer. But don't get too excited, you modern theologians, about that, because you'll twist that. You can't understand him as the redeemer unless you understand him as the creator. There's a better way to say that than even Calvin did, and that's the way Thomas Aquinas or others would have said it. If there's no God, there's no God-man. Right? God precedes. Oh, it's in John 1. The Word became flesh. In the beginning was the Word made flesh? No. In the beginning was the Word. Down in verse 14, the Word became flesh. The order actually matters here. Okay? And so Shedd is saying, you can't even start with a Christological foundation because you'll butcher that, not because there's anything wrong with the God-man, but because your lens will be all messed up. Now, there's an allure to a Christological foundation. We're going to put Jesus first. How do we know God except through Jesus? And it sounds very pious. Sounds good, but it's not. I have some stuff about Bavinck here, but I'll save that for another day. Some things have to get cut. Here's where this matters. This is maybe the last main piece that I'll lay down today. Absolute order, if there is an absolute order with God at the foundation, demands a distinction between two different levels of necessity. Totally not distracting at all, the whole wolf costume thing. But it demands two levels of necessity. Absolute necessity and consequent necessity. Try to focus on this deep philosophy as all that's happening. So absolute necessity, just going to define some terms, and we'll pick up implications next time. But absolute necessity is that necessity which derives itself from no other. Aquinas talks about this in his third argument for God's existence. We'll come back to that in a couple weeks. But absolute necessity is that necessity that derives its necessity from no other. In other words, it doesn't derive it at all, really, right? If it's an absolute necessity, it can't derive its necessity from something else. It is simply necessary. In other words, what's another way to say that? The thing must be. It cannot not be in any possible world. Secondly, there's consequent necessity. Consequent necessity is that which derives its necessity from another. Calvin used language a little like this, but not quite. Turretin says the same thing, but he talks about a kind of an absolute versus a hypothetical, which modern people, hypothetical, they do weird things with that. So let's use absolute versus consequent. Let me give you a concrete example to see why this matters. What if I was to say to you, it is necessary that God exists. Now check the second statement out. It is necessary that Christ save us by his blood. Okay? You notice I use the word necessary in both statements. Let me say it again. And by the way, I'm going to stand behind both of them. It is necessary that God exists, and it is necessary that Christ save us by his blood. Now, anybody want to just raise your hand and say, are those two equally necessary? And if so, what do you mean and what? Yeah.
Well, the second one is contingent or a consequent necessity.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's the bottom line. Now, but we're not taking it back. I mean, we're not saying, so it's not as necessary as I just said. No, it's exactly as necessary as I just said, but you're right, it's a consequent necessity. Meaning, you want to unpack that further? I'll give you a shot. Yeah, what do you mean by consequent or contingent?
It's like, isn't it like necessary for what?
Yeah, that's one way to say it. Or another synonym for that would be dependent on something. Yeah. So yes. What if now it would have been so much easier if I added, and I did it on purpose. What if I added the word if the first time I said it? If I said this, it is necessary that God exist, period. It is necessary that if Christ is going to save us, I added the word if now. If Christ is going to save us, then he must do so by his blood or something like that. Then you would have immediately recognized, okay, I get it. God could not exist. But God may not have saved us. He did not have to save us. But if he freely decrees to save us, then he must do so in a way, and I'll quote John Stott here in his book, The Cross of Christ. He talked like this too. If he's going to save us by his cross, he must do so in a way that does not contradict his character. So even though Stott didn't use the word consequent necessity, which he almost did, and Calvin didn't quite say it in those words, but he almost did, it's a helpful way to structure those out. Both of them, it is equally true that both of them are necessities. But the two necessities are not equal in their necessity. Does that make sense? Okay, one is an absolute necessity, one is a consequent necessity. Now, do you think that's just sort of an isolated incident, or do you think that might operate everywhere in our theological system? I'm thinking why would it operate everywhere in our theological system? Because everywhere in our theological system, God is still God. At every point and every square inch of reality, I was almost going to finish the Kuiper thing, but actually what I want to say here is that no matter where you go or no matter what you're talking about, God could not be anything other than himself. Oh, that sounds like something God can't do. He lacks the power. We'll come to that when we talk about the rock too heavy for himself to lift and all that happy stuff. We'll come to that when we talk about omnipotence and the doctrine of God, but right now, just notice that this matters too. So does our order matter? If we have a different order, we're going to have a different God. If we make everything either equally necessary or equally unnecessary, we're not even monotheists anymore. Your prolegomena actually affects your doctrine of God and your gospel and everything else. Now, one more thing. I lied. I'll throw one more thing at you. Absolute order, if we're going to abide by that the absolutely necessary goes at the foundation and the consequent necessity is built based on that, absolute order will demand a larger deductive system. You may not remember this, but 2 weeks ago, we talked about contemplative theology. We talked about those 4 different basic kinds of logical relationships. And I said that one of them, implication, is going to feature in a very explicit way everywhere in our theological system. Everything, but here's how it functions now. Now we're ready to bring it in. The implication relationship flows. It's like water, right? It's mixing my metaphors. The implication relationship proceeds from the foundation to the structure. And one of the things I'm going to argue here is that, stay with the house analogy, that you have the foundation first, then the structure, the scaffolding, then you could talk about all the stuff from HGTV. You know, the shingles and all that good stuff. Okay, that's a third area. So one of the implications of this is that this is going to issue forth into a theological system in which you have basically 3 different levels. You have the absolutely necessary, you have the consequent necessity, you know what I'm saying, and then you have, and there's a whole lot of ways you can say this, and almost all of them will disappoint somebody. You could say arbitrary, but that doesn't mean the same thing now anymore. It's in the Latin that just meant of will. And so for God's will, God's decree, there are some things that God doesn't decree or not decree. There's just God. That's the absolute necessary, and only God goes there. Then you have the consequent necessities, the thing that God does but could not do so in any other way than would contradict, if he did, it would contradict his character. Then you have a bunch of other things. When you're talking about ethics, theologians would call this the difference between natural law and positive law. Positive law in that context would just mean those things that, as far as we understand, you read in the Torah and you're like, shellfish? What? What's up with that? And theologians go wrong here. we'll come to it when we get to law. I don't want to make too fine of a point on it. My point is that arbitrary is a perfectly accurate word here because they're those things that God did. And as far as we know, we're just to do them, and they would not, if they were done differently, they wouldn't necessarily affect the gospel. So an obvious example is baptism. There are things about baptism that have direct bearing on the gospel. You can actually get the gospel wrong by doing that so wrong. Take the Lord's Supper. Obvious example the Reformers had in their crosshairs. Rome's doctrine of transubstantiation and their practice of the Mass, the Eucharist, contradicted the gospel to such an extent that it wasn't an allowable sin anymore. You know, Calvin talked about those doctrines that are the heads of faith, those that if you mess them up, that would actually destroy the unity of the faith. That was his phrase for essential in the Institutes. But then he said, there's a spectrum. There are impurities of doctrine and impurities of practice that don't necessarily make it a false church. But what the Reformers were saying is that the way the Eucharist is practiced so compromises the gospel that you actually have a heretical view or an apostate practice. Does that make sense? And we'll get clear into why that is when we get to that section. But, okay, a couple more minutes. Point is, everything flows from that absolute to consequent to arbitrary. If we come up with a better word, great. Arbitrary doesn't, in this context, referring to the decree of God and his system of truth, arbitrary doesn't mean whatever, whatevs. That's not what we mean by arbitrary here. We're talking about a system of belief that's a reflection of God's decree. So you can bet he has a perfect reason. You can bet there is a right way to think. There's a right view of baptism. There's a right view of the Lord's Supper, and so many other things that we would call secondary. So for now, 2 layers of words. You can use the words essential versus secondary as you flow to the right here, or if you turn the house up and you stick with the house analogy, foundation upward, you can go essential to secondary, or you can say absolute, you want to get this grammar down, absolute necessity, consequent necessity, arbitrary. One of the reasons you want that second level is because now you're dealing with all the creation, soteriology, things that are not God, things that God has done, which he didn't have to do any of it. He didn't have to make a world at all. He is independent utterly. We'll get to that when we get to the doctrine of God. However, you want to have a middle category. You don't just want to say things in God and then everything else that's whatevs. No. There's this middle category that must be there for the integrity of the gospel, and its reason is back here in the absolute category. So why must it be this way? Because of something about God. Okay? So, that being the case, Hodge is going to get the boot again. There is a very interesting and important thing that Hodge says at the beginning, very beginning, first 2 pages of Volume 1, Systematic Theology. He tells you about his method. His method is an inductive method. I'll say it, short version. Basically, he makes an analogy between the scientist and the theologian. And just like the scientist has a storehouse of facts, namely nature, the theologian has a storehouse of facts, namely Scripture. And just like the scientist goes to his storehouse of facts for data, individual facts, and he then assembles it into a scientific theory or whatever else, so the theologian starts with biblical theology, and he gathers these facts and he arranges it into a systematic theology. That method, that direction, flowing from particular blips to more universal categories, is called inductive reasoning, right? So Hodge has an inductive approach, which you can get away with up to a point. There is something I call hyper-inductivism, and I wouldn't accuse Hodge of that, but it was happening at the same time in the 19th century American frontier, where you just got rid of all categories of the mind, and it's called common sense realism. It comes from the century before it. I don't want to get too much into it because don't compare that to realism in the Middle Ages. It was the idea that we can just look at things and we already have in these ink patterns what we need. It's sort of a simple way to defend biblical inerrancy, and and the Princeton dynasty is often accused of it. Hodges and Warfield, both Hodges and Warfield, are accused by church historians like Mark Knoll and George Marsden and others of having this simplistic, what I call a hyper-inductive view, and they just call it common sense realism. It's not to be preferred, and you could make an argument, one of the reasons that Princeton lost its dynasty was because it started with an inductive method. and dismissed realism as the Middle Ages people would have held to it. Yeah, realism is for young people too. Anyway. All right, that's all I got. Questions, comments, anything else?